The last edition of Warhammer 40k I remember actively playing was 4th edition, when I was a 12-year-old 20 years ago. Back when the Marines were still short, squats were dead and gone, and Matt Ward was slightly less hated. Yes, there he is. You know, he's playing Warhammer Fantasy in this picture, but I'm still surprised he isn't fielding Ultramarines. There was good and bad, but one thing that I loved about the game was the freedom. There was a ton of named characters that added flavor to every faction. You could pay for individual models in a unit, so you could have a group of 7 guys if you wanted. Kitting out your leaders with a bunch of super unique items made it feel like a mini RPG. There was just so much freedom. When I was writing my list for my current 10th edition Drakari force, I ran into one limitation that felt so lame. I have a painted succubus. It's actually the first model I ever did a tutorial on this channel, and if you want to see how far we've come, definitely check it out. Oh buddy, look at that focus, nice. Now some things never change, like me messing up my Dark Eldar. Look at that skin tone. Yikes. Of course I want to use this model in my list. I think it's a sick figure and it's painted, so it's one less guy I have to spend time on, but apparently she can't go in any other unit than a unit of witches? Why? I get it, it's thematic, but surely we can conceive of a time when she might lead a different unit of crazed sci-fi pirates? Whether or not it makes sense, we have to live with it. So I guess for week number 4 of the Dark Eldar Army Project, we're painting up a unit of witches. Back in the day before Kill Team was a thing, a little game called Shadow War Armageddon existed, and I was part of a local group playing it with a team of witches. But not just any squad, one of my first attempts at some more serious conversions. Some of them are pretty cool, others are less cool. But we'll be definitely using some of these warriors to get started. Let's spruce up these conversions a little bit. We'll start with our recon expert hanging from the pole. First, I want to take him apart a little bit, just so I can have easier access to the pole and other parts. After that, I'm going to sand down my shoddy sculpting. I added those cool ring details to the bottom of the pole, and I like them, but they're just not very smooth and symmetrical. Next, I capped off the top of the pole with some random sci-fi grebe with some of those Dark Eldar antennae, and then I added some more appropriate spikes to the side of the pole. After that was all in place, I could glue my guy to the pole and then route the chain behind his back from hand to hand. And then I replaced the chain hanging from his hand with just a plastic part. I'm so happy that recon pole chain guy is finally gonna get painted, and he's also making it into a video. I remember when I first converted this model, and I was so happy with the idea and the chain running behind his back. For the witch leaping from the pole, not much needs to be done. I replaced her entire left arm with just one of the normal chain glaive bits. Not sure why I didn't do that in the first place. The weapon looks less impressive for sure, but the chain itself is gonna have way more detail and look way better, and also not break a ton. Or probably break more? Lastly, I wanted to glue in one of those heads that I mentioned I was 3D printing in the first week of this series, and it looked so good. I was so happy with how this particular witch came together. The posing, the energy, it all just felt so very witch-like. But then I realized that I wanted to paint the head separate from the body, so I tore it off again. If you're curious why so many of my old Shadow War Armageddon models have a weird chain weapon, it's because in that list, I think the item was called the Chain Glaive, and it was so broken and the best, and you know your boy's a tryhard, so of course I put it on like every single witch that I could. To finish off the other witches, I basically just decapitated them and then pinned some of those new 3D printed heads to some cork for easier painting later on. On to some priming. And the primer I'll be using is a black one. We're gonna paint these witches a little bit differently than the rest of my Drakari because they're mostly skin suits. So we're actually gonna airbrush the black part and leave the khaki for painting later. Badger Style Res is actually a black color that I like with a nice level of satin, so we'll just start there as a primer and a base coat. And now I want to apply some highlights with some blue. A pretty typical airbrushing procedure for me is to do 2 highlights and then 1 shadow. But in these guys, I'm gonna try to do 1 layer only. So I'm starting from a place that is brighter. I'm targeting breasts, tops of shoulders, tops of calves, tops of thighs, but I'm not trying to run that highlight all the way down the thigh or all the way down the calf. Just hitting the very top of the thigh or the round muscle of the calf. But I was running into a bit of a problem. This color, somber gray from Vallejo Game Color, is pretty much the perfect color, but it's not the perfect paint. I've airbrushed with a lot of Vallejo game color paint, and for whatever reason, this particular bottle of paint is causing more dry tip than I've ever experienced with any other paint. Even significantly lighter paints like white and cream and khaki. The frustration of dealing with that has led to some issues on these models. So I'm gonna need to come back in with some black ink to fix up some of those issues where the highlight went a little bit too crazy due to my frustration of pulling the trigger back further and further and further until paint comes out, and then too much paint comes out. Happens sometimes. Black is a super tricky color to do. You want to highlight just enough that it feels like a plasticky, leathery black, but not so much that it feels gray. You also don't want to be too timid, because then you won't be able to even see the highlight at all. Compound that with the fact that we're using the airbrush and have a little bit less control about where the paint exactly goes, and also the fact that we're trying to do this in 2 layers of paint, it gets pretty challenging. I'm definitely not going to nail it on this first thing. This is the kind of thing that you need to practice and learn over time. On to the next and final airbrushing step, and first we need to do a little bit of masking. I'm going to airbrush all the masks with Molotov Chrome now, so it has some time to fully dry and set up. And for the couple of witches that have the heads attached to their bodies still, I'll just do a quick simple mask with some masking putty. Make sure to kind of flood the surface with this stuff to get a nice smooth mirror finish. I'm going to try something new here. I'm going to move on to base coating all of the khaki. Typically what I might do is add some recessed shades to the black and also maybe an edge highlight. But I'm also aware of the fact that the more a model gets painted, the better it looks. I want to do less on each individual part of the witch to see how I feel at the end of the paint job. And then if I feel like certain parts need extra love, I'll do that then. Khaki over black isn't a super great time, but I'm keeping my paint on the thick side and applying it pretty thickly as well to avoid having to paint so many layers. That khaki base coating step took me about an hour and 50 minutes. And I think it was Casey Neistat who said, if you don't know what to do in life, do something you truly hate. And you'll spend your entire time just trying to figure out what else you'd rather be doing. And that's definitely true about army painting. There's a lot of time to regret your choices in each individual step. These models are difficult to paint because they're two-tone, unlike Space Marines or Necrons or anyone else who's 85% one color. These guys are split pretty much half and half, so it takes a while to do the base coats on that second half that I did in airbrush. But all this time did give me a pretty good idea on my next step. We'll be shading that khaki with a mixture of sepia ink and also reddish brown ink. This makes a lot of sense because the areas where we might experience overspray on the black won't actually be much of a problem because ink is super translucent and it shows up way more on that khaki than it does the black. And I'm also thinning the ink more than I normally would to reduce that effect even more. Also, the khaki paint from Vallejo Game Color is super matte, so the airbrush paint tends to stick down to that really nicely. Being pretty happy with the idea of the last step, I move on to painting the skin. This is similar to khaki in that it is another bright light color over black, so kind of difficult to base coat with. But when it's done, hopefully I can do some shading with the airbrush and get a similar result to the khaki. It's also good that I haven't done any highlights on the black and especially on the khaki, because if any ink overspray from the airbrushing shading step did occur, it would show up way more easily on the highlights. I was pretty unhappy with the opacity of the AK Rosy Caucasian skin tone, so I tried 2 other brands that have similar hues, Vallejo Game Color and also Army Painter. And honestly, they're all pretty equal as far as opacity goes. The Vallejo Game Color is a bit too pinkish for me, and both the Vallejo Game Color and also the AK paint seem to split a lot on a wet palette, whereas the Army Painter is more stable and is also more of a neutral color, less pink. But again, no one's really winning the opacity race here. Then, just like with the khaki, I took some ink and started to shade the skin tone. But this had much less of an effect than it did with the khaki. Probably because there's less skin tone to actually see the effect taking place. Maybe not worth it. I'm always surprised about how much you learn about a model when you're batch painting it. In this case, with the Witch, I feel like it would have been a good idea to do a minor subassembly of keeping their right arm off, just so I can use the airbrush to paint it, which would be so much faster than painstakingly applying all these base coats with a paintbrush. Sure, I'd have to paint the glove black again, but I think that's faster than doing what I'm doing right now. Keep that in mind if you're painting witches and you haven't assembled them yet, like I have. Now on to doing some military green base coats. I'm targeting the handles of knives, the casing on splinter pistols, the wraps around their knees, what looks like a dish rag around their waist, and maybe the special weapon or 2. It is Friday at 7:22 a.m. and the step you just saw is the last step that I completed. And today is a podcast recording day. Me and John are recording an episode of our Trapped Under Plastic. If you don't know what that is, you can find a link down in the description below, Miniature Painting Podcast. But I'm clearly not going to finish here. My parents are coming over this weekend to help me move houses, so that's not much time available to me. And I also have to take a look at the edit for last week's video that is not done yet, but will be done by the time you see this video. So it doesn't seem like it's in the cards to finish this whole unit this week, unfortunately, but just so you guys have something to see and can see my finished vision for one of these witches, I'm gonna finish up one of them. I think what I want to do now is do a little bit of highlighting with white ink. I figured that if I have to deal with fixing the black anyways, because my khaki base coat wasn't the cleanest, that I can also deal with a tiny amount of overspray. And I can keep it super limited if I get really close to the bottle, turn down my PSI, and use pretty diluted paint. This is a really tricky thing to totally dial in, and I was constantly adding a tiny bit of ink, adding a bit more thinner to get the right ratio. So I wasn't getting speckling, but I also wasn't getting spider webbing. I want you to see how close I am to the miniature in this shot. The tighter you are, the more accurate you can be, and the less overspray there is. A really great question at this point is, why bother with the airbrush with this particular step? And the answer is because a paintbrush could only ever hope to get this kind of smooth and bright highlight this quickly, if everything goes right. If you have spider webbing, if you have overspray, if it's speckly and not good, that answer may shift a little bit. But assuming you can nail this, and it seems like for the most part it's going pretty well, then it's totally worth it. But it does require some finesse and definitely practice. All right, let's start on this one witch we're actually gonna get finished, and we're gonna begin with the black, just cleaning up some areas that got some messy khaki base coats on them. Next, I'll take a brown color and base coat some of the bags on her waist, but also use that exact same paint to do some recessed shading. I have very matte paint on this model, and if I were to apply a wash to it, it would dull it down extremely. That and a wash could only ever hope to be as crispy as this. You may think this step takes a long time to do, but this entire model took 1 minute and 20 seconds for this particular step. For me, that's totally worth it. With that done, I'll move over to the skin, and I'll take the same skin that I used originally and mix a little bit of off-white yellow into it. I don't want a lot, I want just a small amount. I don't want to mix a very bright highlight because I don't want to do any blending, like wet blending, glazing, etc. I want to apply a layer of highlight and have it not be too obvious. With that done, I mixed a slightly brighter layer of highlight and applied it to the very topmost parts of the muscles. Again, like the recessed shading on the khaki armor, this step went really fast because there isn't much exposed skin, but what there is looks pretty good. Next, I want to do a little bit of highlighting on the black. The airbrush leaves really nice soft highlights, but we need to define some of that. So I hit some of the gloves, some of the harder edges on the skin suit, etc. I'm again using a desaturated blue here, just like we did with the airbrush. Next up, all the metallics. I base coat all sorts of stuff like the gun, the rings around her ankles, the spikes, the weapon of course, and some of the elements on her waist. With a lot of those base coats done, we can now do one big wash step where I wash the military green and the brown bags in a brown wash and all the metallic stuff in Drakenhof Nightshade, a blue wash. With the wash drying, we can now move over to the tubes for the combat drugs, which is really simple. We're just using some Vallejo Express paint that is teal. Now that the wash is dry, we can move back over to the silver to do a little bit of highlighting just on the details that matter, like that gun that's kind of forward facing, and also a little bit of dry brushing on all the chain of the weapon. A lot of the small details don't get any extra highlights, just the ones that are easily highlightable and more obvious. With the model pretty much done, other than the head at this point, I was taking a look at it and something didn't feel right. I didn't do any edge highlights on the white armor, and I want to do some right now. I'm not edge highlighting everything, especially the parts you can't really see from the tabletop, or some of the mushier details on the back. And I'm curious what you think. I timed this step, and here's the before and after. Would you do this step in your paint plan if it took 4 minutes and 3 seconds? For me in my painting, I think I would, but I'm curious to hear from you. With the main body done, I move over to the head that we base coated in Maltol Chrome all that while ago. This is honestly just more of the same stuff. Some khaki, some black ponytail, some teal accents, etc. Lastly, I slapped some base coats on the base with some yellowy brown color and some teal, flood the whole thing with some dusty enamel wash, and then airbrush the outside with that orangey fiery color. And with the slick black base trim applied, that is witch number 1 complete. With that head glued on, I freaking love this model. I think it looks so cool. My succubus and another witch of mine are painted in my old scheme with yellow and khaki, and I wasn't sure what to do with this squad. I didn't know if these two should be special looking and I should use the black and khaki scheme that I come up with for all the other guys, or if the witches should remain the same. I actually put that decision to a vote on my YouTube community, and you guys picked the black and khaki, and I agree. I think it looks really good. The motion of this witch, the chrome dome, all of it just comes together so nicely. But the obvious elephant in the room here is I did not finish the other witches. It is Monday, the start of a new project week, and I only finished one, and the rest are probably like, I don't know, 70% finished. It took me about an hour to finish up the guy you're seeing now. In the beginning of this whole video series, I said I created a modest schedule for myself, but I'm coming to understand what modest means for me and how fast I can paint a squad of dudes. Maybe it would have been faster if I didn't do any kit bashing in the beginning, but honestly, the kit bash guys are my favorite ones. I don't know if I'll finish this army on time, but I'm gonna keep plugging away at it and putting as much time as humanly possible in this, because I wanna see this army done. I'm getting more and more excited the more pieces start to come together. I appreciate how many of you have been enjoying the Dark Eldar Army project. I want to give you a heads up. Next week, we're going to deviate from it for 1 week, and then we'll go back to it the following week. But next week's video is super special. It is a milestone for the channel. So I hope, even though it's not Warhammer 40k, you'll still tune into it because it's going to be really cool. In fact, here's a teaser for you. That's gonna do it for this video, guys. If you liked this one, there are several other Dark Eldar videos in a playlist that I'll link at the end of the video for you to check out. If you like the channel and you wanna support it, there are a number of ways to do that. Most notably things like my web store, Miniac.co, where you can pick up things like my cutting mat, or my brush coffin, or some merch, or any of the miniatures that I make. I have a vampire one and several wood elf models. And I also make masterclass courses that teach you how to paint like I do. If you like the way that I paint and you're curious how I do it, check out the Ranger masterclass course. That's the most up-to-date one and really is just a front to back, fully inclusive painting course about how I paint, why I paint the way I paint, describing all the techniques that I use, and then of course showing the paint job itself. If you also want to support me in other ways, you can check out Patreon. You get access to behind the scenes posts about what I have going on during the week, access to my Discord server, access to early release videos, and more. Subscribe today! And most importantly, don't forget to paint my minis!